it and the clerk recorded it, and I've announced the result. The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
I move that the Resource Legislation Amendment Bill be now read a third time. This bill is a critical part of the government's program to increase the supply and affordability of housing, to grow the economy with more jobs and higher incomes, and to also improve New Zealand's environmental management. The bill is a second phase of our reform program that began with a major bill in our first term, but for which we were unable to get progress in our second term because we were unable to secure a parliamentary majority. It is a significant milestone that today we will pass this 250-page bill involving 40 substantial changes and over 700 specific provisions after multiple rounds of technical advisory groups, public consultation and negotiations with other parties in this Parliament. Parties opposing this bill are doing New Zealand a disservice. In the committee stages, they quibbled at the edges, they tried to manufacture myths, but they've been unable to mount any credible argument against the substantive reforms in this bill. In fact, they barely mentioned them. This bill introduces national planning standards so as to simplify the 80,000 pages of resource management rules and policies, more than 1,000 pages per council, that make the RMA a nightmare for New Zealanders to navigate. A country of 4.7 million people cannot justify that level of bureaucracy. It makes common sense that we have standard zonings, standard ways of measuring things like the height of a building, standard definitions and a standard format for our plans. The bill radically changes the way plans are written by introducing a new streamlined and collaborative process. This matters because it takes on average 7 years currently for a council to complete a new plan, and that is just too slow to address the sort of water and housing issues that our communities face. We know this new streamlined process works because our government has used it through special legislation and writing new plans for the major cities of Auckland and Christchurch through special legislation. The overwhelming message is that the process was robust, the plans were better, and the results achieved in a fraction of the time. I am equally appalled that members opposite are opposing the addition of natural hazards to the matters of national importance. Earthquakes, floods, cyclones, tsunamis and landslides are not something to play politics with. The recent quakes in Christchurch and Kaikoura, the floods in Auckland and Northland earlier this year, and the flooding of Edgecombe today are reminders of the significant natural hazard risks our country faces. This change was recommended by the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Christchurch earthquakes because planners had been so diverted by the more politically correct requirements of the current Act that those hazards were overlooked. Every responsible member of this House, genuinely concerned with the well-being of our country, should be backing the inclusion of this important requirement into the most central part of the RMA, its purposes and principles. One of the biggest issues facing our country right now is the supply and affordability of housing. I am gobsmacked at members opposite who demand that this be addressed and then come down to this House and oppose the very measures that will make a real difference. Report after independent report, be it the Productivity Commission, be it the Treasury, be it the OECD, be it the New Zealand Initiative or the Property Council, make plain that it is the supply of land that is at the core of the issue. The numbers speak for themselves. The cost of building an average 170 square metre house in Auckland has increased from $120,000 25 years ago to $360,000 today, a threefold increase. But the cost of the average section, Mr Speaker, has on the same period gone from $53,000 to $530,000, a tenfold increase. You cannot pretend to be serious about improving the affordability of housing unless you are prepared to address the price of new sections and the reform of the very Act, the RMA, that governs their creation. This bill introduces a new specific requirement on councils to free up land supply. It removes appeals on resource consents for residential development. It reverses the presumption in favour of subdivision. It removes the double charging system of development and financial contributions to a single, tighter regime. This will help bring the cost of sections down. This bill is also a help in getting the roading, the rail, the water, the telecommunications and electricity infrastructure built to support our strongly growing economy. It will speed up the process for getting designations and consents. The changes to the Public Works Act, giving more generous compensation to affected landowners, but also including a financial incentive to be able to do so more early, will help get the infrastructure that our country needs more quickly. Another important issue in this bill progresses is that of water quality in enabling national regulations requiring stock to be fenced out of waterways. Only 3 of our 16 regional councils have any rules on this. National rules are a sensible way forward, backed up by the instant fines in this bill. Members opposite cannot cry foul in any credible way over the state of our waterways when they then come down to the House and vote against these practical measures. There are also environmental gains in the new provisions that will require offshore platforms to have decommissioning plans. There has been expensive experiences overseas, Mr Speaker, where petroleum companies have exhausted the oil and gas, then leave the huge cost of decommissioning to the taxpayer, and this bill addresses that problem. The bill also tackles the problems of those thousands of unnecessary consents that cause so much frustration and cost for constituents. I've got an example right now in Nelson of the Rutherford Street kindergarten moving just 100 metres up the road to new premises, and the parents and the kindy committee having to fundraise for over $50,000 of resource consent and related costs. I could bore this Parliament for hours with examples of minor projects like decks and carports actually costing more to get a resource consent than they actually cost to build. These issues are addressed with this bill, with the power for a council to be able to waiver the need for the consent, the new 10-day fast-track process for minor issues, and the ability to resolve boundary infringement rules, issues that can only be resolved with the consent of the immediate neighbour. The iwi participation arrangements in this bill are about to make existing provisions in the RMA in sections 6, 7 and 8 more workable. It will enable councils to work out practical ways for iwi to participate in the process and help the system work better by getting early involvement. The law is plain that decisions on plans and consents remains with the councils, and that councils cannot be forced into agreements. There are many councils that already have such arrangements, and they are proving to work well for both iwi and resource consent applicants as a consequence of greater clarity about who to consult and what issues are of importance to iwi. There are dozens of practical provisions in this bill that will reduce bureaucracy and red tape. It tackles the problem of the RMA being used by councils to duplicate the issues that are already regulated in other statutes like building insulation standards, telecommunications regulations, fishing laws, workplace safety requirements or hazardous substance rules. We need a regulatory system that leaves no gaps, but which also avoids double-ups. The changes to the Reserves Act and the Conservation Act align notification periods and enable joint hearings so we won't have the 2 separate processes debating the same project. Mr Speaker, I need to conclude by acknowledging the mountain of work that has gone into this bill over many years. I particularly want to acknowledge Amy Adams, the former minister, who during the last term of Parliament put huge work into its provisions, to Scott Simpson, who worked tirelessly in chairing the Select Committee, to Tūroa Flavel and Marama Fox and their team in the Maori Party, who have worked so hard to find compromises, and to Tim Bennett and George Riddell in my Beehive office, as well as the teams from PCO and the Ministry for the Environment. The passage of this resource legislation bill is a significant milestone for this government. It delivers on reforms planned and promised over many years. It will make houses easier to build and more affordable. It will reduce unnecessary red tape and bureaucracy for Kiwi homeowners, for farms and for businesses. It will help our country build the infrastructure to support a growing economy. It will ensure our country is safer by better managing those natural hazards. This bill is a litmus test for MPs as to whether their intent is playing politics or doing what is right for our country. I urge this Parliament to pass this complex but very necessary reform.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Point of order.
Chris Hipkins, point of order.
Mr Speaker, in 2011 the Standing Orders Committee made some determinations and recommendations to the House around the reading of speeches. One of those was that the Speaker is the sole determinant of whether someone should be allowed to read a speech. But the other was that a minister should be given greater latitude to read a speech where they're dealing with matters of a technical nature. I haven't interrupted the minister because I recognise that the sole right to determine that if someone can or can't read a speech is yours. But if a minister is going to use their right to read a speech to read out a litany of abuse against other members, then that is going to bring the principles that the Standing Orders Committee discussed and disseminated to the presiding officers into significant question.
I thank the member for his points. I am the sole determinant, as you identified, as to the reading of speeches. The minister's, in clarifying the position that the minister has been involved in under his name, has some latitude to read from his notes, and that's always been an accepted practice in this House. And I look very closely at the reading of speeches, and I'm now going to call the Honourable
Mr Speaker.
Is this a new point of order?
It is a new point of order, Mr Speaker.
Chris Hipkins, new point of order.
Mr Speaker, can you clarify the basis on which ministers are allowed to use pre-prepared speeches
I am the sole
to
determinant.
insult?
Well, if there'd been some assault on a member, I didn't actually pick that up. This is a debating chamber, and there's been a robust debate over the last couple of days in the committee stages. There have been no points of order brought up about insults against other members. I've looked very closely. I presided over much of the committee stages, and I listened very carefully to the debate. Now, that's my ruling, and I'm calling on the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we heard it again from the Minister, and I think it's got to be said that the